If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn in it to Luke chapter 8. This is where we'll be spending our time. All of us in this room know that we live in a world of consequences. We all know that. We raise our children that way, right? Don't do the crime unless you want to do the time. There are consequences. Don't do things that compromise your health. There are consequences. Don't be a liar, because if you are, then nobody will believe you when you're really telling the truth, right? There are consequences to that. There are real things that happen in the real world that are just what would be called axiomatic truths. That is, this does this, and because of this, this happens. And there's nothing we can do about that. You don't cross the street without looking. Simple as that. But in the spiritual realm, there are axiomatic truths as well. And Jesus is going to unpack a couple of those for us here today. Let's take a look at our text. I'll begin reading in verse 16 of Luke chapter 8. Jesus speaking, he says, "No one puts a lamp and lights it and puts it under a jar or under the bed. Instead, they put it on the lampstand, so that those who come into the room will see the light. There is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. Therefore, consider carefully how one listens. Whoever has will be given more. Whoever doesn't have, even what they think they have, will be taken away." Now, this is Luke's way of recording a portion of the Sermon on the Mount. If you go to Matthew, you see the whole thing recorded in a block form, start to finish. Luke doesn't do it that way. And for me, when I look at the Gospels, the fact that they are different is a good thing. If they were all exactly alike, I'd say, you know what, these Jewish boys got together and cooked this whole thing up. But the fact that they are different tells me that we've got 4 different authors looking at things in 4 different ways in terms of the things that Jesus' life and teaching, death, and resurrection were composed of. I'm thankful for that. That's verification. And by the way, there's a whole realm of study called unintended coincidences. You may not know what that is. It started in the 19th century, where people who study the gospel carefully, you don't have to be a Greek scholar to do this, you can do it with an English Bible. You will find in the text things that one gospel writer records that you think, what is that? How did that even happen? And you go to another gospel writer, and how that works is shown by the fact of the coincidence in their writing, but they're both writing about it in a totally different way, which shows there's no connection between the writers. They're just recording the events. Very important. Jesus starts off by talking about the fact that the light under the lampstand, the light on the lampstand, the way that the lamp is lit, you want to use it so that everybody sees. And he's referring to the fact that you and I are believers and we're walking in this world. I mean, we kind of understand that, right? Jesus' parables are not there to confuse us. They're there to make things simple. And he says, look, a believer's life is seen. We become born again, our lives light up in a sense, and people see that. But it's not to say, he's not saying, and you and I have met people like this who flaunt their life with Jesus in front of everybody to make sure, darn sure, that everybody sees it. That's not what he's talking about at all. People like that, I don't know what to make of that. I remember a song back in the 80s that was a Christian song that said, you're so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. Well, sometimes that can be the case. I mean, if I've got a friend who, when I speak with them, the first thing they do is quote some scripture verse to me and ask me what I think about it. Well, heck, I might not even know where the scripture verse they're talking about is or what the context is or anything else. I'd say, well, I have to look it up. But they want me to know that they really know their Bible. That's a good thing. But that's not what Jesus is talking about here. He's saying that, look, if you and I are authentically following the Lord, people are going to see it. That's all. People are going to see it. Now you might think to yourself, well then how come Jesus doesn't just say that straight out? A parable is not there to confuse people. A parable is like Aesop's fables. Aesop's fables were there, a neat story to teach a lesson. Jesus' parables are neat stories to teach a lesson. They're there to take something that's profound or difficult sometimes and make it simple for the hearer to understand. That's why he does it. Of course, if a person's heart is hardened, it doesn't matter how simple the parable, they're not going to hear it. That's why in Mark, when he records this, Mark records also a text out of Isaiah that says, seeing they will not perceive, Isaiah chapter 6, hearing they will not understand. And he applies it to the teachings of parables. He's not talking about the parable, he's talking about the person's ability to hear. That there are just going to be people who aren't going to hear. They're going to walk away. I remember last week in Sunday school, I forget who it was that said this, I don't see how, Rip, a person can hear the gospel and not believe it. Or can think about these things about the Lord and not understand them. Well, remember last week's sermon? Probably don't. That's okay. We talked about the parable of the sower. 4 kinds of dirt. And only one of the 4 was worth anything to the gospel's sake. What does that tell you? If you take that parable and say, okay, it's a demographic, that means only 25% of the people that are going to hear this are going to believe it. Now, I'm not saying it's a demographic. I'm just saying narrow is the road to salvation and few find it, Jesus said. Wide is the path to destruction and many go that way. That makes good sense to me. After all, Paul says to the church at Corinth, in his second letter to the church at Corinth, he says, look, when anybody turns to the Lord, the veil is lifted. There's something that happens to us when we become followers of Jesus, wherein now we understand in a way that prior to that we could not understand. That's supernatural. But I'm going to say anybody can understand things normally. And that's why Jesus told these parables, because he knows that people who are willing to listen, who have ears to hear, they're going to listen to the simple parable, they're going to understand it, and they're going to get the message that he's trying to convey. And so will we. But there are people who don't want to understand. And God is not going to trample that. You remember, if you go back and read, for instance, the record of Moses and the Pharaoh. All right, it says in the text, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. But that's not all it says. It also says, and Pharaoh hardened his heart. And the two are about 50-50 split. What does that say? It says to me that at any point in that chain of events, Pharaoh could have, like Nebuchadnezzar, decided that God was God. And he could have said, you know what, Moses? I believe that Yahweh is Lord, and I believe that you're telling me the truth, and so I'm going to let the children of Israel go. He could have done that. At any point in that chain of events, he could have made that choice, but he didn't. And so God hardened his heart. Why? Because he knew that Pharaoh was going to harden his own. And by the way, that doesn't say anything about salvation. That's a whole different category. Romans chapter 9, where Paul uses the example of Pharaoh and a hardened heart, that's not talking about salvation. We need to keep that in mind. Then Jesus talks about things that are hidden in this little text. I have friends, think about this in 2 different ways. Number one, to hide something from God is probably one of the silliest things we could possibly conceive of in our minds. I mean, the Bible says God knows everything. It says that there's nothing hidden from the sight of him with whom we have to do. Well, that clears that up. So you and I, we might think we hide from God, but we're not hiding from God. But the problem is, we kind of believe we are. And how do I know that? Every person in this room is hiding something right now. So am I. All of us in this room. None of us, I have a friend of mine who says this to me, oh, I'm just an open book. No, you're not. You're just like everybody else. I am convinced that this hiding thing is something that marriage helps us out with a whole lot. Right? If I could give one piece of advice to anybody who's dating prior to marriage, I would say this. It's the only advice I'd give them. If they're cruel now, you best not marry them, because once you marry them, you better believe that's how they'll be. Don't think that because you've married them, somehow they're going to clean up. Who they are now, they'll be more so once you're married. Why? Because what's hidden leaks out. We get into a spot where everything's comfortable, you better believe it comes out. Now that's partially what Jesus is talking about here. Partially. We believe things about ourselves that are not true. That's the worst part of it. We do. I had a friend, they would go to the movies. And in the movie, there'd be the main character would have a pair of sunglasses. How many of you remember the movies, the Men in Black movies? Did anybody ever see those movies? I saw them, man. I like those kinds of movies. Space aliens and robots. They wore sunglasses. Or The Matrix. Those three movies. They wore a certain kind of sunglasses. Ray-Ban put their factories into overdrive when those movies came out to make those sunglasses, because they knew that a bunch of people would want to have those sunglasses. I had a friend who would buy those sunglasses, and they actually believed that somehow that made them a different person by wearing those sunglasses. We can fool ourselves. Do you think car ads work because we're thinking in practical terms about a car? Most of the time, no. Most of the time we see the hunk in a hat or the supermodel behind the wheel smiling, and we see ourselves like that. So we want that car. That's why the ads are like that. They don't. Isn't it weird that they talk about the cars in the ads in ways that don't have anything to do with this car will be cheap to operate and last for a really long time? You don't see that in the ads, right? You see people jumping out of a whatever on the beach with surfboards. This is what you can do if you have this car. We fool ourselves. We fool ourselves. And the worst thing about it is that a lot of times we fool ourselves into thinking that we can actually hide from God. Now, I think we can. I don't think it's that He doesn't see. I think, but He will let us hide from Him if we like. Some of us will do it for a lifetime. There are elements of who you and I are that we'll hide from God, and we'll hide them for a lifetime, and God will say, if that's the way you want it, go ahead. But be aware, just like in a marriage or a friendship, if you and I hide from somebody, there's a part of us they do not know. And if we do that, that relationship will only be that deep, no deeper. And God is the same. If you and I decide that we're going to conceal from God, He'll let us. But the relationship will only be that deep. If that's the way we want it. It's up to us in that sense. What about this last part that Jesus talks about here? The one who has a little, what they have will be taken. The one who already has, more will be given to them. What's He talking about here? I remember when I first became a believer and I saw this text, I just thought, that doesn't seem fair. How does that work, God? How do you behave fairly toward people if you're going to take the person who's already got plenty and give them more, and you're going to take the person who doesn't have and you're going to take away from them what they have? What He's speaking about here has nothing to do with fairness. It has everything to do with choosing. You and I live in a culture that tells us that we can kind of drift and float. I had a friend of mine once, I went to their house, and we were talking about their life with the Lord. And this person said to me, there comes a place in life where you got to kick back. And I thought, well, what do you mean by that? See, when you and I say yes to Jesus, that's not something we retire from, ever. Ever. But we can. We can. We can make choices to do what I would call drifting. We can float. We can do that. but it's impossible to really drift. Let me explain. This speaks to exactly what Jesus is saying here. If we look at life as a river, a continuum flowing, that river, it flows not based on what God is doing, but it just flows. The culture makes it flow, the world makes it flow, it's flowing. You and I we have to get into the river. We don't have a choice about that, we're here. If the river is flowing away from God, then there's only one option for us if we expect that we're going to be close to God, and that's to swim against it. That's the only choice we've got if we want to stay close to God. But you see, a lot of people look at this river and they say, you know what? The culture's telling me I really can float. And guess what? We really can. And you know what? Floating's not hard. Put the inner tube in the water, jump in it, prop up, and just let it take you wherever it's going, right? That's what, I did that. You ever been to Itchytuckney Springs? That's what you do. You get in here, you get in an inner tube. The bottom half of you is frozen, and the top half of you burns up while you float down this river in this ice cold water until you get to the end. Then you get out and you think, man, I had a good time. This part's parboiled, that part's frozen. I can't feel anything in this part of my body. This part's red and hurts. But the river takes you down where you're going. You don't say anything about it. If you get in the water, you're going that way. Talk to somebody, just picture this as this swimming against the current imagery. Talk to somebody who has had to rehab a limb. Okay, let's say, for instance, shoulder. You get a shoulder replaced. After a few weeks, once you heal up, what they're going to do is a therapist is going to take you in there and he's going to make, or she is going to make your shoulder go way further than you want it to go. It's going to really hurt. And you're going to wonder to yourself why you're allowing yourself to do this. Well, you're doing that so that you'll be able to lift your arm up and scratch your own head. Because if you don't do the rehab, you will not. Those tendons will never stretch out. Your shoulder will never operate in the way that it's supposed to. If we're not moving forward toward God, we're moving back. If we don't do the rehab, we're moving backward from the place of healing. We have to make that choice. How many people have you known in your life who go to college for 4 years? I know somebody like this. 4 years of French. They're in their 40s now. They can't speak a word of French. Why? They never use it. They never exercised that French. What they took all that money, the 30 or 40 or 50 or 100 or nowadays $300 a credit hour to learn French, is now in file 13 for them. They don't have any concept of speaking French ever again. No practice, then we start to lose what we have. That's the same principle in the spiritual life as well. We cannot go forward with God. We will always either be going back or toward. There is no neutral. There is no floating here. If we think we're floating, we're moving away the whole time. What is it to be a disciple? We use that word, we're disciples. What does that mean? It means a learner. That's all it means. If you and I, we're all in this room, disciples. We are here discipling one another. Well, if we choose to not be part of the discipling exercise long enough, we're moving back, away from God. That's all there is to it. If we're not, let's just take the disciplines. You know, the word disciple and discipline, they come from the same root. Scripturally, if we're not in an ongoing examination of the Scriptures, then we're not learning. If we're not praying, if we don't have an ongoing conversation with God, then that's not happening. If we're not in an ongoing sense of worship, and I don't mean singing hymns, that's a small part of it. I mean that our minds are trained as we move about in this world to see the miraculous hand of God in everything. If we're not doing that, we're floating backward. Mentally, if we're not engaging our minds in understanding better who God is and what He wants and what His Bible tells us, then we're floating backwards. Guess where that stuff happens? I hope it happens in here. So, if God gives somebody the gift of salvation, which He does do, and we're given that desire to be with the other believers, and we're given that desire to learn, and we're given that desire to pray, we're given all those desires, and we don't exercise any of them, what's going to happen to them? We're losing them. They will be taken away. Not because God's mean, but because that's the axiomatic truth of the universe. It's just the way it is. You know, if I take anything, if I go home and I decide this afternoon, you know what, I'm going to drink a fifth of liquor every day for the rest of my life. I'm going to pickle my liver in liquor for the rest of my life. What will happen? Bad things will happen to my health, won't they? That's an axiomatic truth. If you and I decide to pickle our spirit in the world, it's an axiomatic truth that it will be pickled that way, and things will happen. What will happen? What has been given will be taken away. Cannot grow toward the Lord without making the effort to grow toward the Lord. It's not possible. God gives us the greatest gift we could ask for. What is that gift? For me, maybe I'm the only one. The greatest gift is, this day I do not have to remain as I am. I can go forward. I can learn more. I can become closer to God in my relationship. I can see this life that He's given me to live on this earth be a better life than it would be otherwise. But it's up to me to do that. He's not going to make us. You ever talk to somebody who's been away from congregational life for a long time? You know what the most common response is to that? It's so hard to go back. It is so hard to come back. Why? Because all that has been being built has been eroded by being away. And it becomes very difficult to come back. Those senses of desire go away. That's just how it is. There's no getting around that. Is it that God is just being harsh? No. I think about, as I've been studying the Old Testament for weeks now, and I think about the Jews. God's got a lot of other methods at His disposal to help us come back. Read the history of Israel. Lots of other methods. But taking away what has been given is only one. But that's an awfully mild one compared to a lot of them. I've talked to so many people in my life, you probably have too. They say the best thing that ever happened to me was that week in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling. The Lord brought me back. It doesn't have to go that way. You and I can choose. And then what we have, more will be given. What God has given you and me in this room, what we have, if we continue in the disciplines, more will be given. For those who have had and do not continue, it'll be taken away. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, speak with me, I'll stay here as long as it takes as we close.